They were good. They were good.
Absolutely, absolutely. Friction and technology. I'm enormously impressed by such technical skills. I have 4 electricians in the audience. More than that.
How many historians?
No, let's not tempt fate, do we? More let's exchange there. Anyway, through night and blood. And no work, remember this is more, yet written, conveys to the thinker a clearer conception of all that the red streak in their flag stands for than this deep and philosophical analysis of war by Clausewitz. Maud compared Clausewitz to Charles Darwin. For both have proved, he wrote, the existence of the same law in each case, viz., the survival of the fittest. Neither was concerned with ethics or morality. As a result, the gradual dissemination of the principles taught by Clausewitz has created a condition of molecular tension in the minds of the nations they, that is to say the statesmen of Europe, govern, analogous to the critical temperature of water heated above boiling point under pressure, which may at any moment bring about an explosion which they will be powerless to control. Now, given that sort of guff, written in 1908, with the outbreak of war, you would have expected that to have been seized upon by Allied propaganda. Well, when the war did break out, the Oxford History faculty, of which I am a member, which then effectively also doubled as a politics department, produced a series of pamphlets designed to show the underlying causes of the war. 86 of these pamphlets were published between August 1914 and early 1915, several of them written by Spencer Wilkinson, who in 1909 had been appointed Oxford's first professor of military history. The centenary of the chair was marked last year. He had spoken of Clausewitz in very positive terms in his inaugural lecture. And in the same year, in 1909, he wrote a foreword to Major Stuart Murray's book, The Reality of War, which was one of those inevitable short guides to Clausewitz, which everybody writes from time to time, including me. On war is, Wilkinson wrote, from beginning to end, nothing but common sense applied to the subject. And he went on, its value consists in the influence which he cannot but have upon the way in which a man thinks about war, about public affairs, and about human character. I venture to say that no officer will read with any attention the work of Clausewitz without shortly finding that he has become a new man, seeing the world with fresh eyes and facing his problems with a judgment and a confidence before unknown to him. Even as late as June 1914, just over 5 weeks before the outbreak of the First World War, and only days before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Sarajevo, Wilkinson spoke about Clausewitz's understanding of war in similarly enthusiastic terms in another lecture which he delivered at Oxford. But within 2 months of delivering that lecture, Wilkinson was writing one of the early Oxford pamphlets called Great Britain and Germany, and he did so without mentioning Clausewitz at all. Instead, he took, as the representative of the German army, of what he called the gospel of force, not Clausewitz, but Friedrich von Bernhardi, author of On War Today, and a book designed specifically to bring Clausewitz up to date, and the author of Germany in the Next War, both published in 1912. It was this last book, Germany in the Next War, which ensured that Bernhardi, not Clausewitz, was to be the symbol of German militarism castigated by Allied propaganda in the early stages of the war. Bracketed with Fichte, Treitschke, and Nietzsche, Bernhardi became the symbol of the idea that for Germany, might was right. And Clausewitz simply disappeared from all commentaries. He is not once mentioned in any of the 86 Oxford pamphlets. how are we to interpret this sudden disappearance? Well, the mood, of course, among the Allied countries in 1914-15 made it very hard to say nice things about any German, even those of whom one might be tempted to approve, like Kant or Beethoven. And I suspect that actually Clausewitz came into that category. Because for those who had read on war, Clausewitz, although he was a Prussian, was actually quite a decent one. He was still on the side of the angels. The novelist, politician, future Governor General of Canada, an author of books that Brian reads when he's taking his exercises, John Buchan, in volume 2 of his Nelson's History of the War, published early in 1915, devoted 2 chapters to the great atrocity stories of the early stages of the war. That is to say, the German occupation of Belgium and German methods and aims in waging the war. In those chapters, Buchan referred to Clausewitz twice, and both times in the context of common sense. He accepted Clausewitz's argument that war should be waged wholeheartedly, for the more wholehearted it is, the quicker it will be ended. And he went on to say that Clausewitz had long ago warned his countrymen that it was inexpedient to do anything to outrage the general moral sense of other peoples. After the war was over, in 1921, Buchan distilled the 24 volumes of Nelson's History of the War into 4 volumes called A History of the Great War. And now he was much more open in his praise of Clausewitz, calling him wise, likening our war to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and as a product of Glasgow University as Smith was, that was quite some praise. And Buchan said that On War explored the foundations of statecraft and showed in the intimate connection between principles and facts a manual alike for politician and soldier. Now, Buchan had not deemed it prudent to comment and to commit to print in quite those terms while the war itself raged, not least because by 1917, Buchan was the de facto head of government propaganda in Britain. And although he believed that propaganda should rest on fundamental truths, he probably appreciated that too many positive remarks about a Prussian would have been politically naive in the fervid atmosphere generated by the populist press. Nonetheless, by the later stages of the war, as opposed to the opening months of the war, Clausewitz was creeping back into public debate in the Anglophone world. The satirical British magazine Punch, on the 20th of June 1918, dubbed Spencer Wilkinson the British Clausewitz, and they intended that as praise rather than as abuse. Much of Buchan's propaganda work was directed here to the United States, particularly obviously before the entry to the war. And in 1917, Robert M. Johnson published the first ever American volume devoted to Clausewitz, called Clausewitz to Date, derived from articles in the Military Historian and Economist, and published in a handy format designed to be taken into the trenches. In Britain, in March 1918, T.D. Pilcher, a British Major General who had commanded a division and been wounded at the front, published a book called War According to Clausewitz. This embraced only volume 1 of Graham's 3-volume edition of On War, which also, of course, reflected the publication sequence of the original German, which came out in 3 volumes. And volume 1 of On War embraces the first 4 books of On War. In other words, it follows a progression for the most theoretical of the books on war, that is the first on the nature of war and the second on the theory of war, through to a discussion of strategy, which is book 3 of On War, to combat itself, which is book 4. In other words, if your first opening, an introduction to Clausewitz, was by reading Pilcher's book in 1918, battle was the payoff. Tactics was the conclusion. And that was exactly the message Pilcher wanted you to take away.